Ladies and gentlemen, one of the hardest things God will ever ask a person to do is to let go of the pain they have learned to live with. Not because the pain is good, but because pain can become familiar. Human beings have a tendency to hold tightly to what hurts them because at least it feels predictable. A wounded heart often believes that staying attached to disappointment is safer than stepping into uncertainty. And that is why many people remain emotionally exhausted for years. They are not only carrying memories, they are carrying identities built around those memories. Some people no longer know who they are without the hurt. They have repeated the story so many times that the wound has become part of their personality. They wake up thinking about betrayal. They measure every relationship through past disappointment. They interpret every delay as rejection. And without realizing it, they begin living defensively instead of faithfully. Their energy is no longer focused on growth, purpose, or obedience to God. It is consumed by emotional survival. But God never created you to spend your life surviving pain. He created you to walk in freedom. The problem is that freedom requires release. And release feels frightening because it demands trust. When God says, let go, He is asking you to stop gripping what you cannot heal on your own. He is asking you to surrender the illusion of control. Many people hold on to resentment because they believe it gives them power. They think that replaying the offense protects them from future hurt. But psychologically, the opposite happens. Whatever controls your attention eventually controls your emotional condition. If your mind constantly returns to bitterness, fear, anger, or regret, your inner life slowly becomes shaped by those emotions. This is why unresolved pain changes people. It changes the way they speak. It changes the way they trust. It changes the way they see themselves. A person who is not healed often expects abandonment before love even has the opportunity to prove itself. They assume failure before trying. They reject themselves before others can reject them. And over time, they become imprisoned by thoughts they never challenged. That is why surrender is not simply a spiritual command, it is also psychological liberation. When God asks you to release pain, He is not minimizing what happened to you. He is not pretending the betrayal was acceptable or the loss was insignificant. God understands suffering more deeply than any human being ever could. But He also understands that pain becomes dangerous when it becomes permanent residence in the heart. A painful moment can teach you something valuable, but if you continue living inside that moment emotionally, it begins to distort your entire perspective on life. Some people are waiting for God to remove the burden while refusing to unclench their hands from it. They pray for peace while feeding anxiety every day. They ask for healing while constantly reopening old wounds through obsession and rumination. There comes a moment when faith requires action, not dramatic action, but internal surrender. A decision that says, Lord, I cannot carry this anymore. I release my need to control the outcome. I release my demand for immediate answers. I release the bitterness that has exhausted my soul. And that kind of surrender is not weakness, it is maturity. Strong people are not those who carry endless emotional weight without collapsing. Strong people are those humble enough to admit they were never designed to carry everything alone. Pride says, I will manage this myself. Faith says, God, this is beyond me, and I trust you with it. You see, many people believe peace comes after circumstances improve. But Scripture repeatedly teaches the opposite. Peace begins internally before it appears externally. That means you can experience stability even while uncertainty still exists around you. You can sleep at night even before every prayer is answered. You can move forward without fully understanding the future because your confidence is no longer rooted in visible outcomes. It is rooted in the character of God. And this is where transformation truly begins. The moment you stop worshiping your wound. The moment you stop defining yourself by what broke you. The moment you realize that your pain may explain you, but it does not have the authority to own you. God can use suffering as a chapter in your life, but He never intended it to become the conclusion of your story. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that God changes your circumstances immediately. Sometimes the greatest miracle is that He changes you in the middle of them. He teaches you how to release fear. He teaches you how to think differently. He teaches you how to trust Him beyond emotion, beyond logic, beyond visible evidence. And once that happens, you begin to discover a freedom the world cannot manufacture. Because the life God has prepared for you cannot be entered with clenched fists. It begins the moment you finally let go. One of the most confusing experiences in life is when God begins removing things you thought you needed in order to survive. People often expect God's guidance to feel comforting from the beginning. They imagine that divine direction will always arrive with clarity, reassurance, and immediate understanding. But many times, God's work begins with disruption. He removes what has become too important to you not to destroy you, but to reveal what has quietly been controlling you. Human beings become emotionally attached very easily, not only to people but to routines, ambitions, identities, and familiar environments. And the longer something remains part of your life, the more difficult it becomes to imagine yourself without it. That attachment creates a dangerous illusion. You begin believing your stability depends on what is temporary instead of who is eternal. And slowly, without realizing it, by it, your confidence shifts away from God and toward the things you can see, predict, or manage. This is why loss feels so devastating to the human mind. Loss exposes dependency. A relationship ends, and suddenly you realize how much of your emotional security was built on another person's approval. A career collapses, and you discover your identity was deeply connected to achievement and recognition. A season changes unexpectedly, and you begin to understand how fragile your sense of control truly was. What makes these moments painful is not only the removal itself, but the internal confrontation that follows. God begins revealing the deeper truth beneath the surface, and most people resist that process. They ask, why would God allow this to happen? When the more important question may be, what is God trying to free me from? Because sometimes the very thing you are begging God to preserve is the thing preventing your growth. Comfort can become captivity when it keeps you from obedience. Familiarity can become dangerous when it keeps you spiritually stagnant. There are people who remain trapped in environments that are draining their spirit simply because uncertainty feels more frightening than dysfunction. But God loves you too much to allow you to remain imprisoned by what is slowly destroying you. One of the deepest struggles in human psychology is the fear of emptiness. People fear silence, separation, and transition because those seasons force them to confront themselves without distraction. As long as something external occupies the mind, a person can avoid deeper spiritual examination. But when God removes the noise, the soul becomes exposed. Suddenly you are forced to ask questions you avoided for years. Who am I without this position? Who am I without this relationship? Who am I when applause disappears? Those questions are uncomfortable because they uncover how much of our worth was attached to temporary things. And yet that discomfort is often the birthplace of transformation. You see, God does not remove something valuable from your life without purpose. Sometimes He removes what is good because He sees what is greater. Human vision is limited to the present moment, but God sees the long-term condition of the soul. He understands which attachments are strengthening you and which ones are weakening your ability to trust Him. What feels like rejection may actually be protection. What feels like delay may actually be preparation. And what feels like loss may become the very thing that redirects your life toward its true calling. The difficulty is that spiritual growth rarely feels pleasant while it is happening. Most transformation begins with discomfort because growth requires separation from old ways of thinking. Even psychologically, people resist change because the brain prefers familiarity over uncertainty, even when familiarity is unhealthy. That is why some individuals repeatedly return to destructive relationships, toxic patterns, or limiting beliefs. The known pain feels safer than the unknown future. But faith requires the courage to move beyond what is familiar. There are seasons when God intentionally dismantles the structures you depended upon so that your foundation can be rebuilt correctly. Not because He wants you to suffer, but because He wants you to stop placing ultimate trust in things that cannot sustain you forever. Anything temporary will eventually disappoint you if you expect it to carry the weight only God can carry. And this is where surrender becomes deeply personal. Because when God moves something, you must decide whether you will interpret the moment through fear or through trust. Fear says, my life is falling apart. Faith says, God is separating me from what no longer belongs in my future. Fear focuses on what disappeared. Faith focuses on what God may be preparing next. That perspective changes everything. Some of the greatest blessings in your life will arrive only after certain attachments are broken. Some forms of wisdom can only be learned through loss. Some levels of spiritual maturity can only develop when the distractions are stripped away and you finally recognize that God alone is enough. And once a person reaches that understanding, they stop chasing security in unstable places. They stop worshiping comfort. They stop resisting every uncomfortable transition. Instead, they begin trusting that even painful seasons can become instruments of divine direction. Because sometimes God removes what you are holding on to simply to place your hands in a better position to receive what He has been preparing all along. One of the greatest tests of faith is learning how to remain spiritually steady when nothing appears to be changing. Human nature crave bias movement. We want visible progress, immediate answers, and clear confirmation that our prayers are producing results. And when those things do not appear quickly, the mind naturally begins drifting toward discouragement. People start questioning God not because He has failed them, but because He has not moved according to their preferred timeline. That is where many people misunderstand the purpose of waiting. Waiting is not evidence that God has abandoned you. Waiting is often the environment where God performs His deepest internal work. The difficulty is that most people evaluate progress externally while God focuses internally. We look for changed circumstances, but God looks at the condition of the heart. We measure movement by visible outcomes, while God measures it by spiritual maturity, wisdom, endurance, and trust. And those qualities cannot be developed instantly. There are certain lessons that only silence can teach. In seasons of constant activity, people rarely slow down long enough to examine their inner life. They remain distracted by ambition, pressure, entertainment, and routine. But when God allows a waiting season, distractions lose their power. The soul became, by Tai. Ohm's more aware of its fears, insecurities, and hidden dependencies. Waiting exposes what activity often conceals. That is why waiting feels uncomfortable psychologically. It confronts the human obsession with control. Most individuals are comfortable trusting God as long as they can still predict the outcome. But true faith begins when certainty disappears. It begins when you continue obeying God without visible evidence that things are improving. That kind of trust transforms a person from the inside out because it forces them to stop relying entirely on emotion. Emotions change daily. Some mornings you feel hopeful, other days you feel defeated. If your relationship with God depends entirely on emotional reassurance, your stability will always fluctuate with circumstances. But mature faith is built on conviction, not mood. You see, many people believe waiting is passive. They imagine it as wasted time, a frustrating pause before real life begins again. But biblically speaking, waiting is deeply active. While you are waiting, God is refining perspective, strengthening character, correcting motives, and teaching endurance. The external situation may appear unchanged, but internally something essential is developing. Consider how often people ask God for greater purpose while resisting the preparation required to carry it. They pray for influence but have not yet developed humility. They ask for blessing but have not learned discipline. They desire open doors but lack the wisdom to walk through them responsibly. If God answered every prayer immediately, many people would arrive in situations they are emotionally or spiritually unprepared to sustain. So the delay itself becomes mercy. God sees consequences long before human beings do. He understands the timing necessary for growth. A farmer does not become angry because a seed remains underground for a season. The hidden process is necessary before visible fruit can emerge. In the same way, some of God's greatest work in your life will happen beneath the surface where nobody else can see it. And because it is hidden, many people assume nothing is happening at all. But silence does not mean inactivity. Some of the strongest individuals are formed in seasons where they felt forgotten. Not because God ignored them, but because He was teaching them how to trust Him beyond constant reassurance. Spiritual, immature people require immediate signs to remain faithful. Spiritually mature people continue walking with God even when emotions are unsettled and answers remain incomplete. And this is where patience becomes powerful. Patience is not merely the ability to tolerate delay. It is the ability to remain emotionally grounded during uncertainty. It is refusing to let fear dictate your decisions while the future is still unfolding. Many people sabotage their own growth because they panic during waiting seasons. They rush into relationships they should avoid. They force opportunities before the timing is right. They abandon assignments simply because results were not immediate. And often the damage comes not from the delay itself, but from the impulsive decisions made inside the delay. But when a person truly trusts God, they stop treating waiting as punishment. They begin understanding it as preparation. There is a psychological strength that develops when you learn how to remain steady without constant validation. You stop depending on visible progress for inner peace. You stop allowing temporary uncertainty to convince you that your life lacks direction. And slowly, your confidence, IT, shifts away from external outcomes toward the unchanging nature of God Himself. That transformation changes the way you face every challenge afterward, because once you survive a season where you had nothing to rely on except faith, you discover something important. You discover that God was sustaining you even when you could not see what He was doing. You realize that the silence strengthened you instead of destroying you. You recognize that the waiting was not empty after all. It was building resilience, wisdom, discernment, and spiritual depth that comfort alone could never produce. And perhaps that is why God sometimes delays the answer, because the person you become while waiting is just as important as the blessing you eventually receive. The greatest danger is not that God makes you wait. The greatest danger is losing trust while He is still working behind the scenes. There comes a moment in every person's spiritual journey when they realize that exhaustion is not always caused by hard work. Sometimes exhaustion comes from resisting God. A person can spend years trying to control outcomes, force relationships, predict the future, and protect themselves from disappointment. Meant only to discover that the constant need for control slowly drains the soul. The mind was never designed to carry the burden of absolute certainty. Yet many people live as though everything depends entirely on them. They analyze every situation endlessly. They replay conversations in their head. They worry about tomorrow while still carrying the pain of yesterday. And beneath all of it is one central fear, the fear of surrender, because surrender feels vulnerable. It requires a person to admit that there are limits to human understanding and limits to human control. But that admission is not defeat, it is wisdom. One of the deepest illusions human beings struggle with is the belief that control creates security. In reality, excessive control often creates anxiety. The more tightly a person grips every outcome, the more fearful they become of anything unpredictable. That fear eventually affects every part of life. Relationships become strained because trust is replaced by suspicion. Peace disappears because the mind never stops anticipating problems. Even spiritually, many people claim to trust God while emotionally behaving as though everything depends entirely on their own fighting. And that internal conflict creates instability. You cannot experience the fullness of faith while remaining committed to complete self-reliance. At some point, every believer must decide whether God is truly trustworthy or merely comforting in theory. Because genuine surrender only happens when trust moves beyond words and becomes a lived reality. This is why surrender is so transformative psychologically and spiritually. The moment a person releases the obsessive need to control every detail, emotional space begins to open inside them. Fear loses some of its power. Anxiety no longer dominates every thought. The soul becomes quieter, steadier, less desperate for immediate answers. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the burden of carrying the entire future alone is finally lifted. And that is where many miracles begin. Not always miracles in the dramatic sense people expect, but miracles of transformation. A hardened heart becomes soft again. A fearful mind becomes calm. A person who once lived in constant tension begins experiencing clarity they could never find through overthinking. When surrender becomes real, something shifts internally. You stop fighting battles God never asked you to carry. Many people delay their own healing because they are still trying to control the method through which God works. They want God to solve problems according to their preferred timeline and preferred outcome. But faith does not mean trusting God only when His plan matches yours. Faith means trusting His wisdom even when His direction feels unfamiliar. And often, God works most powerfully in the areas where human control finally ends. Throughout life, people spend enormous energy trying to preserve what was never meant to remain permanent. But God sees beyond temporary moments. He understands connections, opportunities, and seasons in ways the human mind cannot fully comprehend. What appears to be falling apart may actually be divine rearrangement. What feels like an ending may become the beginning of something far healthier, wiser, and more aligned with your purpose. The difficulty is that surrender usually happens after disappointment. Most people do not release control willingly at first. They release it when they finally realize control was never giving them peace to begin with. And perhaps that is part of God's mercy. Sometimes He, allows human effort to reach its limit so a person can finally discover the freedom of dependence on Him. Because dependence on God is not weakness, it is alignment with reality. You were never created to carry infinite pressure, infinite foresight, or infinite responsibility. Only God can hold the weight of the entire future without collapsing beneath it. And when you truly understand that, surrender stops feeling terrifying. It begins feeling necessary. Then, instead of asking, "How can I control this situation?" you begin asking, "How can I remain faithful while God works?" That shift changes everything. It produces peace in uncertainty, stability in transition, and hope even during unanswered seasons. And over time, you begin recognizing something profound. The moments that transformed your life most deeply were often the moments when you finally stopped resisting God and trusted Him completely. Because God does His greatest work in the lives of those who finally release what they were never meant to control.